brakes. Brakes and brake hardware. Now brakes, we talk about brakes, and people say I got the brakes done, or I got a brake job, and that's a very broad term, as are many terms in the automotive industry. A restoration can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So I want to try and narrow it down. I had the brakes done. Well, the brakes are broken down to the hardware and the hydraulics. Now, I have a little note here that I have to forgive the experts in the room. Please forgive me. I have to be rather basic so that I can appeal to everyone who may not know what you know. So if I'm telling you stupid basic things, just tune in. But I gotta reach the people who don't know. So there's the hardware, and then there's the hydraulics. The hardware is the brake pads, the brake discs, the drums, the shoes. Those are the brake hardware. Those are the items that are causing your car to stop. Then you got the hydraulics, which are those components that activate the hardware. So when you get a brake job, I mean, did you get the hardware done? Did you get the hydraulics done? Or did you get it all done? You have to know. If you bring your car in and you spend a few $100 and the guy does the brakes, if you spend a few $100, he didn't do it all. He just did what was necessary. So 6 months down the road, if you have a leak in the brakes, well, you can't blame him because he only fixed the hardware. So you have to understand the broadness of it. So I made this very, very, very crude drawing, which is pretty pathetic. But I'm not an artist. But it kind of will follow through with the pedal on the car. You push down on the pedal, it pushes a small piston or a push rod. And this is a typical brake master. This is actually a clutch master, but this will work. This is, for an early car, it's also a brake. Okay, so your pedal is attached to this rod. You can't see it. It's out of sight. You push down on the pedal. It depresses this push rod, pushing the fluid that's in the reservoir out the line, the hard line that's attached here, okay, to usually some kind of a junction, which will then split the fluid and the pressure that you're applying to the front and also to the rear. And then when it gets to the rear, it splits again and goes one to each wheel, and then down, same in the front. So what you're doing here is you're dispersing the hydraulic pressure and the hydraulic fluid in order to activate those devices that are at each wheel that will activate the hardware. So what's at each wheel? Well, in the back, if you have drum brakes, typical drum brakes, you have a wheel cylinder. It's a tiny little device, and the line is attached. It's carrying that fluid under pressure, and it's causing these little tabs on the end to expand ever so slightly, and the shoes are attached. I know this is basic for many of you, but many of you it's not. So these are tapped into here, one on either side, and it's expanding the shoe and pressing the shoe up against the inside of the drum. And that's causing you to slow down and stop, hopefully. So that's the basics. That's how it works for the most part. Later cars will have, like 68 and later, for the most part anyway, will have a more involved master cylinder, and this would be a two-line master cylinder. So if you lose fluid or lose pressure in one of the systems, you won't lose your brakes completely. A line will split. It'll go to one side of the car, or the other side of the car, or the front or the back. So you're always going to have some braking power with a later style master cylinder. But the early cars in the 50s and 60s and 60s have the earlier style. So that's the basic method as to how this works. At the corner, I explained the wheel cylinders, and I'm going to get into that later in more detail. In the front, you'll have a caliper. This is a TR6 caliper, and the caliper houses the pads. And again, the pressure is coming in, and internally, what it's doing is it's pushing out. There's two round pistons in here. It's pushing those pistons, or clamping them, I should say. It's clamping the pistons, which is clamping the corresponding pads up against your disc, which is right here. So This is riding in here. This is TR6. This is MGB. But you get the idea. It's riding in there. You put your foot on the brake, and it's squeezing this rotor, stopping it from rotating, and causing you to stop. So that is the basics of how it's working. What are some of the problems that you would encounter with brakes? The simpler problems are worn hardware. This is a MGB brake pad, front brake pad. These are front brake pads. It's metal backing, and they're all the same. They're all designed the same. They just have different shapes, but they all, they're all designed the same way. There's a metal backing, and then an asbestos or whatever, whatever material they're using. There's, a bunch of different things. And what you do is you want to make sure that you don't wear the material down to a point where it's low or thinner than the metal backing plate that it's on. So as amateurs, you could jack up your front of your car, you could take off your wheels, and you could look in there. It's very easy to see. You could look in there and look at your pads. You can look at them with a little flashlight and see, do you have as much meat as you have metal? And if you don't, then it's time to change the pads. Because ultimately, if you ignore all that, you're going to wear down the pad completely, and you'll be forcing the metal on, to ride against the rotor, and that's what makes a horrible sound. I mean, you'll know it when you hear it, but it will ultimately score the surface of the rotor, making it as not as effective as it could be. It'll have ridges in it. It'll be worn. This is brand new. If I had one, and I'm sorry I don't, to show you that was worn, it would have ridges in it. It would have a wear lip, so the very outside surface would be thicker than the mating surface where the brakes are touching, and that's just from years of thinning it out, so to speak. So as an amateur, that's something you can do very easily. You can just jack up your car, look at the brakes, and say, hey, I need pads, look at that. The other important thing when you're looking at the pads is to look at them and make sure that the meat that you're looking at is even, it's equal. If you have a caliper with a pad on either side of it, and you look at it with your flashlight, and one of the pads has got plenty of meat on it, and the other one is significantly less, then you have a sticking caliper. You have a situation where every time you apply the brakes, only one of these pistons in here is expanding and applying the brakes, and the other side is not expanding, which means it's stuck, and you're not getting the effective braking that you need. And that's very common. They'll stick from corrosion, from sitting, from the brake fluid being old and corrosive. So, and again, we'll get into that later too. So just as an amateur, that's something that you can do and you can look at. On the same token, you can remove your rear wheel and wrestle the drum off. And on some cars, it's as simple as just a couple of screws that hold it on. Of course, your handbrake has to be off. Let's remember that. The handbrake activates the rear brake. You want to take the two screws that hold it off and just take it off. If you're lucky, it just comes right off. On wire wheel cars, on some cars, there's the big nut in the middle, and you've got to take the whole drum and the hub off with it. It's a little bit more intimidating for an amateur, but that's what's got to be done. And the idea is you want to get in there and look and see the surface of the drum that the shoes are riding on. Make sure it's nice and smooth. It's not all scored. You want to make sure, same thing with the shoes, that the wear material is at least as thick as the metal backing that it's on. Some shoes are bonded. The material is bonded to the metal backing plate, and some are riveted on. If you get it down to the point where it's worn out and the rivets are now digging into the inside of your shoe, you're really doing some damage. So again, these are just some of the things that the average Joe can do in his garage and just keep his eye on the integrity of his brakes. I touched upon it briefly that the handbrake activates the shoes. There's another mechanism within the brakes that spreads those shoes so that you have a handbrake, and there's always an adjustment on the wheel depending on what kind of car you have. An MG is one way, MGA is different, Triumphs are different again, but generally it'll be a bolt on the backing plate that you would adjust, which spreads those shoes ever so slightly, until you have a very light drag on the wheel, and then you know your handbrake is adjusted. You don't want it to be too tight. Of course, there's also adjustment in the handbrake cable, which if you're unable to achieve a good feel to your handbrake by adjusting the brakes, then you got to go to the cable, and that's a little more involved. I'm just trying to touch upon some of the things that you can do and help you understand how everything is working. So, what kind of problems do you have with your brakes? Well, you know, they're spongy, they don't work well. The most common problem is you put your foot down on the brake, the pedal goes down to a certain level, you might have some braking power, but then when you let go and immediately push down a second or third time, the brakes feel much better. It's like, wow, you know, they work good, but I got to pump them. Well, what's going on there? Why is that happening? Well, you have air in the system. I described this hydraulic system. This is completely closed. I mean, this is filled with fluid. The reservoir is filled with fluid. The lines are filled with fluid. The wheel cylinders are filled with fluid, as is the caliper. And it's just waiting for you to apply the slightest bit of pressure to force that fluid. The fluid is carrying the pressure of the pedal. It's waiting for that pressure to activate the brakes. If you have a leak in the system, or air has entered the system, you're not pushing 100%, you're not pushing fluid, you're pushing air. So that first pump, you kind of have to, you got to overcome the air that's in there, and then the second pump, you're finally now working the brakes the way they're supposed to. So if you have to pump the brakes, or if the pedal's real low, that's the first sign you got a problem. You could also have you could just have worn hardware. You could have pads that are just so worn out that they're not stopping well. You could hear a horrible screeching noise or a grinding noise when you apply the brakes. That's a sure sign that you've got worn hardware. You could have another common thing is that brakes will pull or they don't release. You're driving down the road, you put your foot on the brake, and the car wants to go a little bit to the left. With each time you put your foot on the brake, it goes to the left or goes to the right. Or after you let off on the brakes, you can kind of still feel a drag maybe for a moment, and then it releases. So usually what's happening there is that the hose, and I haven't really talked about this part of the hardware, and I should. Of course, you have lines that I talked about earlier, and these are all throughout the car, from the front to the back. You got copper-type brake lines, or the new ones are Cupro nickel, I think they call them. It's part copper, part nickel. I'll get back to that, and I don't want to forget the hoses. The hoses are usually at each corner to link the hard line, which is firmly attached to the chassis, to the actual wheel, because there's movement in the wheel. As the wheel goes up and down, it's you need some flexibility, so that's where the hoses come in. The important thing about a hose is that they get old. It's just a rubber hose, and they get old and cracked, and you can see by examining them, just by looking at them. This one has a metal spring around it, and this is from an MGB front suspension, because evidently the way it's routed, there is a remote chance that the hose could come into contact with a component as you turn the wheel left or right. So what they did is they protect the rubber by having this outer shroud on it, which protects it from being chafed by a component in the car. But this hose is cracked here on the outside. It's very easy to spot. This is not well, I shouldn't say this isn't dire, but I mean this is a crack.
That's dire.
It's dire, but it's not fully cracked to the point where it's leaking, but it's awfully close. So if you have something that's that bad, you know it's time to get a new hose. So that's what you want to do. As you're there looking at your shoes, you can examine the hoses. If they look dry rotted and cracked, it's time to get new hoses. The other thing that can go wrong with a hose, and this is pretty common, and I was talking about it with the car pulling one way or the other or not releasing, is that the hose could be so old that it's corroded inside, internally, the inner surface where the fluid is riding. Now this is a clutch slave, but this is essentially the same hose and the same system. By the way, pretty much everything I've discussed here so far, and will continue to discuss, applies to the clutch as well. And the clutch has clutch hardware, it has the clutch disc, the throwout bearing, the pressure plate, and then it has the clutch hydraulics, which activate those things. So when somebody says, I need a clutch, or my clutch doesn't work, you know, well, is it hydraulic, is it mechanical? So it pretty much applies to clutches as well. But this is a clutch hose, and this was cut, And if you were able to study this thing, you would see that the inside orifice where the fluid is traveling is very soft. It just gets soft over time. And it becomes like a one-way valve. So now you've put your foot on the brake, you're forcing the brake down with a fair amount of pressure, so the fluid is able to get to these components and activate them. But as soon as you let off on the pedal, that pressure should disappear. The only thing holding the pressure is your foot. Well, if the inside of the hose is corroded, it acts like little rubber flaps in there. It'll act like a one-way valve, and it'll hold the pressure on one of the wheels, front or back, causing that wheel to either stay on and causing you to pull, or stay on and causing it to drag. So if you have that situation, it's almost always a bad hose, and you just put new hoses on. But that's an important thing. So the most common problems are, bad hoses, leaking hoses, crimped brake lines. Here's a brake line that is in the back of an MGB. MGBs are very common for crimped brake lines. They run along the front of the rear axle. So when your car breaks down and you call the tow truck, and the guy comes and he's dragging his knuckles on the ground. He's got that big chain with the hook on it. If there's any tow truck drivers here, I apologize. And he, from the back, he takes that hook and he grabs that axle and he pulls your car up onto the tow truck. And he doesn't realize it because he can't see it, but there's a brake line on the front side of that axle. So he has now completely crimped and crushed your brake line, in a little 1-inch spot, which is going to prevent the brake fluid from getting to that wheel and returning from that wheel. And I would say that more than 50% of MGBs that come in have crushed brake lines in the back. And more than 75% of MGBs have a bad wheel cylinder. It's just a weak spot in the braking system on a B. They just tend to go bad. They just leak really easy. So you have to examine the brake lines, brake hoses, and if you need a new brake metal line, the nice thing about Moss Motors is in their catalog they have all the lines listed. You can buy it as a complete set, and if you're doing a restoration, you just start with fresh lines, or you can buy whichever line you need, and it comes already made in the length that you need with the right fittings, and it's labeled with a part number so you can reference and find out where it belongs. And the real nice thing is that it's easy to bend into shape. Now, many years ago they would be, I guess, stainless steel, or it would be a material that was hard to bend.
That was federal. It was a requirement.
Okay.
To have steel brake lines.
Right. So you have to have a special tool and really be patient bending this thing into the right shape, because if you went too aggressive on it, it would just crimp. These are very hard to crimp. They're wonderful to work with. So I really like these. And most of the suppliers are selling these, but Moss is my main supplier, so I always reference them. But that makes your life easier. You don't have to have a flaring tool. You don't have to make up the length that you need and the right fittings. It's all made. They've done all the research for you. Just don't reinvent the wheel. It's already done. You have old hoses. You have worn hardware. You could have leaks. The most common, so you open up the hood, you're going to take the car for a ride, you want to check, your fluids, check the oil, checking everything, and you notice that your reservoir is this reservoir, folks, and I know everyone here knows this because you're all experts, but for all the people out there that don't know, there should be fluid in here at all times. And it's amazing how many cars come in and, it's half empty. There should be brake fluid in here. It shouldn't be black. It should be relatively orange color, and I'm going to get into that later. And if there's no fluid in here, or there is less than the optimum amount, you got a leak. So if you have a leak, you need to get it fixed. Now either this is leaking, or the wheel cylinder is leaking, or one of your hoses is leaking. That's a little uncommon. The calipers are pretty robust, quite honestly. They on a scale of how many wheel cylinders to master cylinders to calipers you rebuild, you don't do calipers very often, unless it's a really old car that's been sitting around a long time. But if there's no fluid or low fluid, you have a problem. You have a leak. How do you find the leak? The first thing, you can start at the master cylinder. If it's a simple master cylinder like this style, you can just, wherever this is bolted onto your car, if it's bolted onto the bulkhead or what have you, just look at the area of the bulkhead just immediately behind this flange, because that's where it's going to leak from. It's going to leak out of the master cylinder, past the rubber seals that are in here, and it's going to leak and ruin your paint. So if you've got bubbling paint or discolored paint, that's your first sign. On some cars, you can tell by touching the brake pedal, the actual pedal inside the car, because it'll leak down this little push rod and then down the pedal and into the car. So if you get in your car one day and there's some, it's a little slippery, and where'd that come from? And it's not water, it's brake fluid. That's a major problem, and you need to address that immediately, because that's a leaking master cylinder, and it's leaking enough for you to really notice it. So that's sometimes they leak so finely that you don't necessarily notice it, because it builds up in here as like a crusty material. So it doesn't really show it rear its ugly head until you look in there and you see there's no fluid. The reason I have these two master cylinders is these are simple to rebuild, and these are very difficult to rebuild. There's two sets of pistons in it. It's like 2 in 1, and they're very hard to get apart. There's some clips inside there that are very difficult to get apart. We don't rebuild cylinders in general, and from a business, from a business standpoint, if I spend an hour cleaning your master cylinder up in the parts cleaner, taking it apart, cleaning everything up, buying the $25 rebuild kit, putting it all in, honing it if it needs to be honed, putting it back in the car, and then 2 months later it leaks, who's on the hook to repair all of that? I am, because it didn't take, and it doesn't always take. So, plus, I don't know how many times that cylinder's been rebuilt in its lifetime. It's a 50-year-old car. It could have been rebuilt 5 times already, and every time it gets rebuilt, somebody's been in there with a hone, just making it ever so slightly bigger and bigger until the point where the rebuild doesn't take. So, from a business decision, it's much better for us to just buy a new one and start fresh with a new one. 98% of the time it's going to work, and it's going to stay that way. So we generally don't rebuild cylinders. It's just not financially feasible for us. You guys are hobbyists. You're sitting in your garage. You got nothing else to do. You want to be in the garage. You stay away from the wife, the kids, the grandchildren, the mother-in-law. You stay out there and rebuild everything on the car. You got all the time in the world. Knock yourself out. But what's involved? Just briefly. So, we had Keith take this apart for us. So, what would you need? You would need a pair of circlip pliers. There's a little circlip here, and they're all basically the same concept. So, there's a little circlip here. You pop off the circlip, and then everything's going to come out. You want to lay it down on a clean workbench and just knock everything out of there so it all comes out. And keep it in order that it came out. Lay it out on the bench. You're going to look at it, and most of the stuff that's in there is reusable. There's only like 1 or 2 little rubber seals, rubber O-rings, rubber seals that you would buy a rebuild kit for a couple of bucks. This is for a wheel cylinder, but you'll get the idea. It comes with new rubbers. Whatever you got on there, you should have in the box. Take the old ones off. Make sure everything is spotlessly clean. Use a little brake fluid as a lubricant and just basically replace everything that was on there with the stuff that's in the kit in the same orientation. And you would put it back together. Before you put it back together, you want to make sure that the inner surface, this is just a round cave, and it's got to be smooth. The surface has to be very smooth, because these rubber seals are riding in and out of that. If there's corrosion in there, which there's likely to be, because it's an old car, I can feel it with my finger. There's rough spots, there's roughness. That's going to just chew away at the new seal that you put in. So how long is that going to last? If you're flipping the car and you don't care and you're selling it to a guy in France, you could just do that and save money. But if you care at all, you'll just buy a new one, or you'll do it right. How would you clean out that corrosion? How would you make that surface cleaner? You buy one of these little honing tools these are from Sears. They have larger 3-stone ones or 2 stones, and there's just a little abrasive stone on here. You put it in there on the end of your drill, and you just in and out a few times. Basically, that's going to give that surface that's in there a nice smooth surface for the seals to ride on. Put everything back together, put it back in the car, and hope for the best. Again, we generally hope for the best. Yeah. Wheel cylinders are really easy to rebuild. I have on occasion rebuilt some wheel cylinders. T-series wheel cylinders are rather expensive, and it's just, it's worth trying to rebuild them because you can leave them in place. Oftentimes, you don't even have to take them off. You could leave them in place and rebuild them, but trying to get this apart, it's seized. But there's 2 rubber dust boots on the outside to keep the crap away. By the way, the car's up on the lift. You want to examine your brakes. There's the wheel cylinder there. What you do is you take a little screwdriver and you just peel back one of these little cups at the bottom. And if you have an MGB, 9 times out of 10, the fluid's going to come pouring out of there because they just leak. So that's a sure sign. So what you want to do is if you peel back this outer boot and it's dry, you're okay. That means it's not leaking. I should say, just to further confuse things, that just because it isn't leaking doesn't mean it isn't bad. It could be seized. It could be seized in place and it's not operating the brakes. So you'd want to go a step further and get some real, channel locks or something real strong and try and squeeze these 2 little pistons into the cylinder. I mean, if they can't move in, that means they can't move out, and they're not working. So is it worth my time to take this off, take it apart, hone it, unseize it, spend an hour at the bench at $85 an hour, or should I get you a new one for $35? It's better to get a new one for $35.
I have a question.
Yes.
Have you had problems with the new wheel cylinders, master cylinders?
Well,
The quality?
the rubbers.
No, the quality of the entire part.
yeah, I mean, when you look in the Moss catalog or the Victoria British catalog or whatever, again, I reference Moss a lot, but any of the supplier you choose to use, they'll have the original or they'll have a repro. And you can save money by buying a reproduction master cylinder. And we try not to do that. We try to get at least the closest equivalent to what was on there. If it's Lockheed, we want to buy Lockheed. Maybe it's Delphi or AP or something. We want to get a good brand name. I mean, these are the brakes we're talking about. You want to save a few pennies, save it on something else, but not the brakes.
I didn't mean it
But we
because
have
of finances.
we have noticed that
Is there a decent supplier? We had a problem with the Jaguar
yes.
where the calipers, I bought new calipers, and
Right.
it says Dunlop.
Uh-huh.
And then you find out they were made in China.
Yes. Yes. I mean, this is a whole discussion that we could spend another
I mean, is
section
that
on,
occurring with
which is the
MG
quality
Triumph
of parts.
or was it just a Jaguar?
No, it's the same all across the board. The quality of parts has suffered over the years. As mechanics, as professionals, this is not like bringing your car to the Honda dealer where the part that you're putting on was made by the same company that, it's just, when we fit a new part, we often have to assess it, make sure it's quality, that it may need some modification to fit, whether it's a brake or a trim piece or whatever. It's just becoming increasingly more difficult to fit the parts, to make the parts work. Yeah, you'd think so. You'd think so. I know that the replacement, just speaking specifically, there's a replacement master cylinder for the clutch on an MGB, and it's cheaper, and it's got a little plastic reservoir, and it's much smaller than this reservoir, and I've known to have trouble with it. So we don't even fit those anymore. That's the only direct experience I have with brake cylinders. But I mean, just in general, the quality of parts, it's a burning issue. And that's just real brief. That's what the British Motor Trade Association is. If you haven't heard of the British Motor Trade Association, it's a nationwide trade association for companies that are involved in the British cars. Moss Motors, Victoria British, and then every little shop from little old me to big shops that have 5, 6, 7, 8 mechanics. And we join this group. We have our own forum. We have our own message board. We share information. If I find a part that's inferior, I'll share it with them. They'll share it with me. And that's one of the things we try to do is keep Moss informed, because we're there putting their parts in every single day. So if there's a problem with something, we can be the first person to explain to them, hey, this doesn't fit, this tonneau is not big enough, or this pads don't fit, whatever. So that's what the British Motor Trade Association is all about, trying to improve the quality of the parts. All right. Any other questions? So far so good? I haven't lost you? All right. Just let me review here. We talked about all the hardware, we talked about the brakes. So, checking the pads for wear, checking the hoses, checking the shoes, checking the calipers. I didn't specifically speak of that, but the calipers, you know, my experience is they just don't leak as much as wheel cylinders or master cylinders. But if they were going to leak, you would see proof of that. You would see brake fluid in and around. If you see any brake fluid anywhere on the caliper, near the caliper, on the wheel, on the inside of the wheel that's riding around this caliper, if you see brake fluid, you got a problem. That's your sign that something's wrong. You can rebuild a caliper. It's a little challenging. At this point, you can buy brand new calipers, but they're not. You know, if we buy brand new calipers for a Triumph, you know, they're fairly affordable, but you now have replacement calipers on there. So, you know, 10 years from now, somebody else owns the car. You know, they're going to buy a rebuild kit for that caliper, and it's not going to be the same rebuild kit. So, if in the interest of integrity, you would best to be rebuilding these calipers. There's several companies that you can send them to. They will take it apart completely. They will make it like new. It'll look new. It'll be new. They'll see. There's a piston inside here, and I'm sorry I don't have one apart. But there's a piston inside here that goes up and down and operates the pad, as I discussed. And there's a rubber seal in there that surrounds that piston and keeps the fluid where it's supposed to be. So a typical caliper rebuild kit will be, you know, basically just 4 of these large O-rings, and you would separate this caliper and blow those pistons out, which is the hardest part if any of you have tried this, and take it all apart, clean everything up, clean the surfaces, and then fit new seals and put it all back in. But again, you have to worry about the integrity of the surface that this piston and these seals are riding on. If it's all pitted, like the inside of that master cylinder I discussed, you're just going to chew up the new seals. And that's where places like White Post Restoration and Apple Hydraulics and many other companies come into play. They have it apart, they fit this, you know, very thin copper or brass, I guess they use, brass sleeve in there, which is essentially just giving it a new surface. They're starting with a new surface for these seals and the pistons to ride on. And they put it all back together, paint it up nice, send it back to you, got yourself nice rebuilt calipers. It's a fairly cost-effective way to do it. If you try and do it yourself, sometimes the hardest part is getting these pistons to pop out of their spots, because there's nothing to grab. You have to send it out with compressed air. It's a tech session all in itself to explain how to do that. But
excuse me.
yeah.
And once you get one side out, you can't
Correct.
get the other side out.
Exactly. So the air, yeah, just real quick to touch it. I mean, the air, like the fluid is trapped in there. So you would use compressed air into where the fluid would go and shoot the compressed air, and hopefully both pistons pop out of their spot, and now you've got it successfully apart. But what happens is one piston will pop out before the other one does, and now there's a breach in the closed system, so that air isn't going to bring that other piston out. So you got to hold one piston in with a clamp while you're trying to get the other one out, trying not to have it shoot out at your face at 100 miles an hour. So it's a tricky job. Best left for the professionals. And if you find any of those, okay. So we talked about rebuilding the wheel cylinders or replacing them. Talked about the calipers or replacing them. The master cylinders, depending on what you have, you can easily rebuild them. If you know your car, you're familiar with your car, you've had it since it was new, you know how many times the master cylinder's been rebuilt, you know, you can rebuild it. But if it's an unknown to you completely, just spend the money, get a new one, and start from point A. You now know you've got new brakes in there, and if you keep the car for 10 years, you can rebuild it once, maybe twice.
Got a question.
Yeah,
On the brake fluid itself,
yeah,
the DOT
Yeah.
3, 4, 5, silicone versus
yeah.
old style.
And again, that's a whole nother, we can have a whole tech session about that, and everyone here is going to have an opinion about whether you should use silicone or regular. My theory, just silicone brake fluid is, and the advantages are that it doesn't damage the paint. So if you spill it while you're pouring it, if it leaks, it isn't going to damage the paint. If you have an MGA, you have a Bug Eye Sprite, and a leak is really going to wreak havoc on the paint because of the way they're situated, you might want to consider using silicone. But we don't. We just don't use it. I'm an old, just give me good old-fashioned brake fluid. I don't want to get involved in those discussions. But if you're going to use silicone brake fluid, the trick is you have to really clear out the system, and it has to be completely free of any other fluids. And then you would start with fresh silicone. If we're restoring that MGA, which by the way, when I reviewed the shop projects, I didn't talk about that MGA. Let me get back to that. So in that case, we're going to put all new lines, all new hardware. If he wants silicone, we'll use silicone. But if someone comes in for a repair and I got to bleed his whole system. If it doesn't, if it causes a problem down the road, I don't want to be responsible for it. I'm just going to use the right stuff. So it's Castrol brake fluid .4. The other one is Lockheed. It's in a yellow can. Moss sells them both, as does Victoria's, British, and all the others. As far as local suppliers, I know from experience that it's been my experience that only Pep Boys is the one that I've found Castrol in.
They don't have it anymore.
They don't have it anymore?
Not anymore.
Okay, so there you go. So, I don't know, Advance and ABC and Tony's Auto, you might find it, but Pep Boys was always my go-to.
They changed the whole packaging in
Yes.
that market, because there used to be LMA, you used to be able to get a Pep Boys in
Correct.
dumb places, but now you can't, so you have to.
They did change the packaging, now they've kind of highlighted the whole synthetic brake fluid.
It's always been formulated.
Right. So it's been a little confusing to people, but basically you want Castrol. So Moss Motors and mail order companies can sell you the fluid, have some on hand, have some in the car, make sure the cap is tight, because if it leaks all over your trunk, you're going to lose all your paint.
Yeah, Pete, are .3 and .4 compatible?
No. So you got a guy that doesn't know any better, and he goes to Pep Boys and buys .3 that he keeps in the garage for his Chevy. The .3, again, I'm not a scientist, but these brake components and the rubber compound that is involved with the seals is designed for .4. If you use .3, theoretically, you're going to prematurely wear the rubber seals.
So basically, if you've got .3, you should almost get rid of it.
You should flush it all out and get rid of it. And that's the last step in
I
this whole
still might have
process.
some in my cabinet in
Yeah.
the garage. I should probably just get rid of it.
Yeah.
I had heard it was also on like MGs, the aluminum pistons in the steel wheel cylinders were not compatible with certain brake fluids, so we always religiously use Castrol.
Castrol, yeah.
Yeah, is that true or is it?
As far as I know, yes. And actually, I should mention.
The aluminum and the rubber.
I should mention that on many of the new components that you buy nowadays, if you get a master cylinder or wheel cylinder, there'll be a little ticket in there or some kind of disclaimer that if you use silicone brake fluid, they don't warranty the unit. So what that's all about, I don't know, but since I don't use it, I don't care. Jimmy crack corn and I don't.
Can you talk about using older fluid? You have some in a bottle?
Yeah, so I should, and the last part of this equation is the fluid and bleeding the clutch, or bleeding the brakes, which is the one thing that a lot of do-it-yourselfers have trouble with. So hopefully I'll be able to help you. Brake fluid is what they call hydroscopic, so it absorbs moisture. So if you have a container lying in your garage and it's been around for a real long time, and if any of you guys know the more scientific, please chime in. But it absorbs the moisture, and what you don't want in your fluid is the moisture, because the moisture, just like this fuel problem, is going to eat away at and corrode your components. So you want fresh fluid without the moisture, because the moisture is what's going to corrode the inside of the components. So if you have a cylinder that's been lying around in the garage for a real long time, I mean, I honestly don't know the answer to this, like how long what's the shelf life on it, if it's been open already. If someone does know, I'm willing to listen. What we do when we open one, of course they don't sit around here very long, but we just open it up with a little tiny, a small little hole, one for air and one for pouring. I mean, theoretically that's going to maybe cut down on any contaminations that get in here.
Put a little saran wrap on it.
You could put some saran wrap over it and then put the cap on it. But as far as what the shelf life is, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. But it's cheap enough that if you buy some, and what I like to do is buy it in the small containers. If you buy the big quart size, you know, then you're just asking for trouble, because you're going to open it, you're going to use it, and it's going to be sitting in your garage for a couple of years. If you buy 2 or 3 smaller ones, you can just leave them unopened until you need them. Just to keep your attention, the fluid I talked about, there should be fluid in here. It should be clear, or not clear, but it should have a nice little color to it. It shouldn't be black. Why is it black? It's black because it's been in there a really long time, and it's got all sorts of contaminants in it. And a lot of the blackness comes from the deterioration of the seals that are in your brake components. So it's an immediate sign that the rubber seals that are supposed to be, you know, keeping everything together are breaking down, you know, chemically, and that blackness is fogging your fluid along with the moisture that gets in there.
Yeah, Pete, would you say it would be good to change the fluid every couple of years? Let's say, you know, I did it last year.
Yeah.
Wait a couple of years and then flush the system and then put all new fluid in.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the common advice on that is, I think, 2 years. You know, I mean, 2 years. I'll admit it's pretty excessive. I mean, if you're doing it every 2 years, you're really a stickler, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But few of us do that. But
especially
that,
as long as the core is sitting.
Yeah, but again, it's sitting. It's gaining as much contaminants as, you know, as if you're using the heck out of it. So.
Do you have any experience using those dip strips?
Yeah, the dip strips. There are some places you can put you buy a little litmus test type of thing. You put the thing in there that tells you how old it is or how much, you know, contaminants are. But I mean, I don't need that. I can pretty much tell it's black and murky, and it's been in there for 10 years. But yeah, that's a more scientific way of looking.
If you're buying a car and you don't know if it's .4 or .5, how do you figure that out other than rolling it in the paint?
Well, no, yes, yeah. Silicone fluid has a different color to it generally. I know it used to be purple. Is it still purple?
Yeah.
Okay. You can usually tell by looking at it. But yeah, you can take a little piece out and bring it over to your neighbor's car and put it on his hood. Back to Mars.
How much time do you have? You get brake fluid on paint. How much time do you have to get it off?
About 5 minutes.
Yeah, you don't have much time. You got to get to it. You know, get to it, wipe it first, and then go over it with some water and cleaner. Yes. I'm sorry?
Depends how many coats of wax you got.
Yeah, yeah. So, I know, you know, we fought that with your car a number of times. You know, your
I don't have
car's
that
beautiful,
problem anymore.
but
It's bare metal now.
it's bare metal now. Yeah. So bleeding the system. So now you're ambitious. You've changed the master cylinder. You've changed the wheel cylinders. If you do anything to the brakes and disturb that hydraulic flow, you're going to have to now refresh the fluid and bleed the system of the air that you've allowed to enter in. Because again, it should be a solid line of fluid in there. There shouldn't be any air. So if I took a wheel cylinder off the back, and while I'm changing it, of course the fluid is, you know, it's dripping out. I'm losing fluid. Keith taught me a trick where you put some plastic over the master. Take the master cylinder cap off, put some plastic down, and then put the master cylinder back, the cap back on. And it really slows down the drip of what you've opened. So that's if you have fresh fluid in there and you don't necessarily want to change it all. And then the other thing we use is a special type of clamp, and you put it on the hose, the flexible hose nearest to where you're working, so that you again stop the flow of fluid. Now you may want to just do that just to prevent a mess, because it would still be nice if you replaced the fluids. But nevertheless, you've replaced a wheel cylinder, you've replaced the master cylinder, you've replaced the hose, anything you've done, you now have to start fresh. So chances are when you're done with that, your master cylinder is going to be empty because it will have all dripped out. There's a million tools on the market for bleeding brakes, because it's a perennial problem for everyone. You know, I can't get the brakes to bleed. I need my wife to come out and push the pedal, and she hates it, and push and up and down, and you know, it's a big pain in the neck. So there's all sorts of products out there that help you do it by yourself. You know, miracle products. You see infomercials at 2 o'clock in the morning. The two that we use the most often here are. It's a vacuum tool. So they sell these. You hook it up to an air supply, and you put this hose on the bleed screw. Open the bleed screw, and then you pull this trigger, and it will just create a vacuum and just suck the fluid right out of the system. So you can empty a master cylinder by doing that, so it doesn't drip all over you while you're working. You can use this to get the fluid at least started. If you've got a fresh system, everything's brand new, and you put the fluid in the reservoir, there's nothing in the lines, there's nothing in anywhere, and it's going to take you a lot of pumping to get that fluid to flow to all the far corners of the car. So we start with this, put one on each rear wheel and the front calipers, and at least get the fluid flowing to their respective corners. They also sell this type of product that you would just pump it up by hand. If you don't have the supply, you just pump it up by hand like a garden sprayer, and it just creates a vacuum, and you'll vacuum out the old fluid. That's a good way. That's a good way to refresh your fluid. If you don't want to do anything but refresh your fluid, just you can use one of these and just go to each bleed nipple and suck out the fluid, and then start with some fresh fluid and do the same.
Which wheel do you start with?
Yeah, you're always supposed to start with the one that's furthest away from the master cylinder.
Rear passenger. And
you have to keep in mind the travel of the lines. Like on again, I reference MGBs a lot, but like on an MGB, the master cylinder, of course, is on the left front. The line comes back, but it goes to the right. It generally leans towards the right rear wheel, and then goes across to the left rear. So, I mean, if you measured it in distance, I think the left rear is further away than the right rear. This isn't rocket science, but it's close enough, But you're supposed to start with the furthest one and then work your way towards the front. Whenever we put in a new cylinder, I should go back a step. Whenever we put in a new wheel cylinder, or we're working on the calipers, whenever we have the opportunity, we take the bleed screw out and we make sure that the threads are nice and clean. Put it on a wire brush, and we blow through it to make sure it's not clogged, because that'll really foul up your process, because you're driving yourself crazy. There's nothing coming out because it's clogged. And then we'll put a little thread sealant on the threads, because when we bleed them, we're just going to crack it open. We're going to make it loose, just a little bit. We're going to make it loose, and we don't want any air to come out of those threads. So it helps successfully bleed the brakes a little faster. So we've got fluid now. It's kind of in the system. The brake is still a little spongy. It's not quite there. Then we take out the big guns. This is our professional tool, by the way. Can't you tell? It's a coat hanger and a water bottle. Mark hates this thing, by the way, because it always tips over. I need like a big wide bottom jar, that it can sit. But I have it on a hook. So this I can bleed a clutch, and generally brakes, by myself with just this tool. And I'm not a Superman. I mean, Keith can do it too. We can all do it. It's a great tool. It's a one-way valve inside this. At the end of this hose is a one-way valve that Moss Motors sells. It's a little hose with a one-way valve on it. So as I push my foot, so I hang this on a nearby hook. I hook this up to the brake bleeder. I loosen the bleeder. I use a pole. It's best if the car's up in the air, because then you can look and cheat. But so the car's up on a lift. I got a pole. I'm standing outside the car and I'm pushing on the brakes. And while I'm pushing on the brakes, I'm watching this bottle. I can see the bubbles coming up into this bottle. And when I stop getting bubbles, I know I'm done. And then I move on to the next brake. What are the downfall here is that eventually it's going to fill up, and you got to stop and empty it. And then the other downfall is that you're there, pumping the pedal, and keep in mind now, every time you let up on the pedal, you are potentially sucking air in to those threads around the bleed nipple. So that's why I seal up the threads. And
what do you use for that? Permatex or something like that?
Yeah, it's a little tube of Permatex white sealant. You got to be real careful, because you don't want to clog up the system with it. You got to just use it just a little bit. Don't use the tape, because if it breaks down and gets into the system, you're blocking the fluid.
Don't forget to keep your reservoir full too.
Exactly.
One other question on is it better to rebuild your brake cylinder, or is it better to buy a brand new one?
We like to.
In other words, you have it rebuilt by, let's say.
Well, the thing is, you don't necessarily need to send your cylinders out to these places and spend the extra money to get them re-sleeved, unless you've got a rare car that you can't buy new calipers for, you can't buy a new cylinder for. I mean, if you've got a run-of-the-mill car, you can buy a new one. You don't need to spend the money to have it sleeved. I mean, by having it sleeved, you're also pretty much guaranteeing it for life. I think that's their guarantee. It'll never leak. Well, if it does leak, you still got to take it out and send it to them. So it's still a hassle. So that guarantee, what's that worth? You still got it. You're just not going to pay for it, but you still got all the trouble.
You were talking about the vacuum system before.
Yeah.
I have a little handheld device, kind of like a paint gun.
Yes.
And it worked great for that.
Yeah.
And any time, if you have like a power brake or power booster.
Yes.
And you think it may be leaking, you can pull this and pull a vacuum on it. And
Right.
Gauge on it.
The Mighty
It's
Vac.
a great tool.
Mighty Vac. Mighty Vac is the brand.
Yeah.
I have one of those. I was very happy with that initially. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
And then something happened to it, and it just doesn't seem to work anymore. So
Probably one of the seals.
yeah, exactly. So I kind of it's in my drawer. It's in my drawer. But Mighty Vac is a good product. They're all. That's why I say there's a million different products that they try and sell you. But this simple. I mean, when I found this thing, I was desperate. I was by myself. It was after Ed left and before Keith came, and I was here alone most of the time. And I'm struggling to bleed brakes by myself. And I said, let me give this thing a try. It's cheap. It's a little one-way valve. So the idea behind the one-way valve is that, of course, it's letting the fluid out, but then on the upstroke of the pedal, it's not sucking air, or in this case, fluid. So you don't necessarily have to submerge it in the fluid. Since it's a one-way valve, you don't necessarily have to submerge it because it isn't going to suck air. However, if you want to see it from 5 feet away as to whether you're done pushing the air out, I like to keep it submerged so I can see the air coming out.
Eventually those go bad. I've had one.
Do they?
bad, yeah.
Okay.
They don't keep them in the
Yeah.
fluid.
Okay.
The one
But they're-
one of them, the one-way valve, just started. It's rubber and it started to like get big and it wouldn't.
Which makes
wouldn't-
sense. Yeah. This isn't probably
But
helping if I
that's like
haven't
the
it
best thing
submerged.
I've used. I have a coolant pressure tester too that I can pressurize the system, and
Yeah.
I use that in conjunction with it. Sometimes.
There's other devices that would be similar to this. Let's just pretend now it's similar to this, and it goes on the cap of the master cylinder. And it's got a whole different bunch of fittings. And what you would be doing in that case is that you would be pressurizing the system from the top. So rather than sucking from the end, you'd be pressurizing it from the top and pushing it out the wheel cylinder or the caliper. I have not generally used those much. It takes so many different caps, and I think it can make a pretty good mess.
Yeah, that's-
If you're down there working at the wheel, and you don't know what's going on up there, and there's fluid leaking all over.
That's the only way to do it though.
Yeah,
That's Easy Bleed.
Easy Bleed does that.
Easy Bleed, but,
Yeah.
well, the secret with Easy Bleed is, before you put any brake fluid in that reservoir to pump into the system, try the cap, screw it on, put it all together and pressurize it to make sure that it's not leaking any air. And at that point, you don't have to touch the seal on the master cylinder, but you want to be sure that that is tight and it seals properly because of the different caps and the different sizes and the washers and whatnot. But if you dry test it first and it's sealing properly, then it's a wonderful tool.
Yeah.
It works very well.
A lot of them all have their merits, but I mean, I've tried many of them, and I'm just very happy with this one way. There's another, John Heffron brought this up to me, there's a bleed screw, a bleeder that you can actually buy. What's it called? Speedy bleed? Speed bleeder. And it's a, you put it in and replace, and do you leave it in? Is that the idea?
It's got a check valve in it. and
Okay,
you leave
so
it in.
you would replace the bleed screws on your car with this bleeder that has a one-way valve developed in it. And then you would open this up just enough and sit there and pump the brakes, and it's going to shoot out the air and the fluid and not suck in. That's the idea. You don't want to enter. You're not trying to enter the air. You're trying to expel it.
If you have that vacuum thing, why would you bother with the bottle?
I find that the vacuum doesn't get me there 100%. Yeah, I mean it gets me like 90% of the way there, and then that bottle just tops it off perfectly. And like on an MGB clutch, this thing is great. It's 10 minutes, I'm done. It's fantastic.
How about an MDA clutch?
MGA clutch, they're virtually the same, yeah.
Yeah?
I should say this, on a lot of the message forums that are on the internet, guys are constantly talking about, I can't get my brakes bled, I can't get my clutch bled. I have found that if you really are having trouble getting them bled, you have a problem. It's not something that you're doing, generally
You
speaking.
have a bad master.
There's something going on. I mean, if you're beating your head against the wall, trying to get something to bleed, at least with us, it's pretty much every single time we find a situation where, God, this thing won't bleed. What are we doing wrong? Well, we've done it 100 times before. What? It's something going on. You got a bad master, a bad wheel cylinder, but it's usually a master.
I think it's important too to bench bleed the master before you put it on, because sometimes you can damage the seals. You start pumping it dry.
Yeah, I got to be honest with you. I rarely bench bleed a master cylinder, but I understand the merits of it, and I know that's a whole camp, and that's fine.
With the twin circuit ones, sometimes you almost have to.
Yeah.
What you'll find that if you fill a brand new master cylinder up with fluid and you start to pump the pedal, if you're going to try to bleed it conventionally, a lot of times the reservoir won't open because it's dependent on the vacuum inside the cylinder that it would have once it has fluid in it. So you're pumping and pumping and pumping, but you can't get the fluid to start down into the cylinder to begin and build up enough vacuum to open the check valve so that it continues to pump through there. So that's where the bench bleeding comes in, or put your thumb over it before you connect the line and at least draw some fluid into the master cylinder initially, and then it should pump from there pretty well.
I didn't address the later braking systems that are much. I mean, I simplified it as much as I could with this type of system. I mean, this is like a typical 1960s system. But if you get into later cars, you get into Jaguar E-types. There's oftentimes there's brake servos involved. The brake servo will have its own cylinder, and then the line will go down and feed a second cylinder. So, I mean, obviously brakes can be much more complex than this. But for the purposes of keeping your attention and making it as simple as possible, I illustrated a nice early system. But the one thing I didn't address, and I touched upon it earlier, was if you want to look at your master cylinder to see if it's leaking, usually this will be bolted up against the bulkhead, and you want to look right here to see if there's any evidence of it leaking. Well, if you have a car with a brake servo, this is bolted to the brake servo, that big round booster. You won't necessarily see the fluid leaking. It's leaking into the reservoir, into the servo, and you just don't know. Well, where the heck is this stuff going? There's no leaks on the wheels. There's no leak anywhere else. It's sitting in that servo, and if you get enough of it in there, then eventually it creates white smoke. And if you get white smoke and you have a brake servo and you have a brake problem, you got that problem with your servo. Yes, sir.
When you rebuild any part of the brakes, do you use that Castrol brake grease?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
Wouldn't that eliminate any of the screwing up of the rubber seal? And
Yes.
the
Yeah. And when you buy these kits, they often come with a little tube of special lube, and they suggest you put that on the seal. Did I touch upon it?
Brake pads, do you put something on your brake pads?
On the back of the pads?
Yeah.
Yes.
From squealing and stuff?
Yeah. We've had one car that's been very. Actually, it was an MGC that just was rather stubborn when it came to brake squeal. But for the most part, it hasn't been a major problem. But we do put some brake, the product on the back of the pad. Chamfer the edges of the pad, the new pads. There's different tricks, but generally I can only think of one that it was an MGC that just kept squealing.
How about the shims?
The noise reducing shims, I guess, yeah. It's like an adhesive. It's like a little adhesive pad. You cut a little adhesive thing, and you cut it to fit the back of the pad. See this pad? This is metal, and it's sitting against the metal piston. So the vibration there. So you want to try and isolate that. Is what we're discussing here. There's some grease you can put on here. Of course, you want to be extremely careful because you don't want to put a lot of grease on there, and you certainly don't want to put any grease on the front, and you don't want it on the disc or the drum. One other thing, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I just remembered.
It's a special grease too.
It's not just grease, it's special brake grease, exactly. One thing, you're doing your inspection, you take off the drum, and everything in there should be nice and dry. The shoe should be dry, there shouldn't be a lot of moisture. If you have moisture, then you got a leaking wheel cylinder. But you might have a leaking rear axle seal, and I didn't touch upon that, so don't let that fool you. And when the rear axle seal is leaking, it's getting the gear oil all over your shoes. It's getting all over the place. So now you don't really know what you got. You got some kind of leak, but it doesn't matter because you got to take everything out and replace it because it's all contaminated with 90 weight oil, and you'll know if it's gear oil because it has a distinct smell. So don't let an oil axle leak confuse you and think you have a brake leak.
The,
I hope I touched upon it.
with the leaking axle, I don't know, do these, I don't know much about anything except MGAs and JAGs. The A's actually have a drain hole. So if the axle does leak, it goes out behind the brake drum.
It goes to the back of the backing.
The back of the backing
Yeah,
plate.
I don't know if the other cars have that, but you'll find that's often clogged up,
Okay,
and if you,
so then it's
Open that
gonna
hole.
stay and contained within
Yeah.
your drum.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you'll see it that way,
Yeah.
because it's on the outside.
I mean, the bottom line is that there shouldn't be any,
Actually, they
there shouldn't
knew
be
it
any
was
kind of
gonna leak,
moisture
so
back
they
there
made
at
a
all.
provision.
Everything should be dry, whether it's an oil leak or a brake leak. So just to review, as amateurs, you can keep your eye on your fluid level, keep your eye on the integrity of the fluid. It shouldn't be jet black. You can look at the pads for wear. That's easy to do. You can look at the shoes. That's a little bit more involved because you got to take the drums off. I mean, depending on your skill level, and just pay attention to your brakes. I mean, if you have to pump them, then you have a problem. That's the bottom line. If they don't feel firm every time you push them, you got a problem, and you need to address it because it isn't going to go away. It's just going to get worse. So that's trying to simplify it as much as I
You
can.
want to just touch on the proportional valve centering that?
Do I want to?
Yeah.
Not really.
That's where you need the third hand, right?
Yeah. The TR6s and MGBs, things that are in the mid to late 70s have a proportioning valve. It's like a junction box for all the lines to go to, and there's a valve in there that ensures that the fluid is going, properly to the fronts and properly to the backs, and it can complicate the bleeding process. But beyond that, we'll leave that subject.
Pete?
Well, check for leaks too, right?
Check for leaks, exactly. Yeah.
Pete?
If
Yes.
your rotor or drum is scored,
Yes.
replace or have it turned.
The old school is to have this stuff turned, but there's, it's harder and harder to find a place that'll turn your drums and turn this. Luckily, the shop right next door to me, which is a regular car shop, they fix normal cars. They have the thing, so I'll bring them over there. They think I'm absolutely crazy. Normal cars. Why would you subject yourself to working on these cars? And I think they're crazy. Who wants to fix Hondas all day? It's like it's the $10, $15 to cut a drum, to cut a rotor. Rotors are $27, at least an MGB. So that's up to you. It really is up to you. If there's a tremendous, lip here where you can tell this thing is very much thinner than it was supposed to be, just start with new. Yeah. But you can cut them, and cutting the drum, if it's scored, there's a special machine, they put it on, it's a special lathe, and it basically gives this all a nice smooth surface. But keep in mind that you're taking away material now. So how many times has it already been cut before you got to it, and now you're out of spec? So they all have specifications that they shouldn't exceed, 9 inches or 10 inches or whatever. So if it's been cut before and now you're cutting it again, you just don't know. Again, because these cars are so old, you don't know what has happened to them before. So if you have the opportunity, start with something new.
That was the problem I had on one car where the rotor, the drum was cut a little bit larger.
Yeah.
And the rubber part of the slave cylinder came out just enough where it caused the leak. And it wasn't the slave cylinder problem. The problem is it was
cutting on the, yeah. I mean, these things will they're only moving a tiny bit when you apply the brakes. So, with every cut of the drum, you're losing a little meat.
Oh, Pete?
Yes.
Just one thing that I found in my experience once, I was inspecting my brake parts, and this vehicle had never been driven in the rain and been parked in the garage, et cetera, et cetera. And when I pulled the drum off and actually peeled back the rubber lip on the wheel cylinder, I was shocked at the amount of condensation that was present behind that little rubber seal. I mean, it was like you took a little spritzer and just spritzed that area. So a good idea if you want to maintain your brakes is take your car out, drive it a couple miles, do a couple hard stops with it, get the brakes good and warm so that when you park it, it tends to bake that out of there, and at least you're starting with it dry when you park. Because like I said, I was truly shocked at how much condensation had gotten behind those rubber boots. and just was going to sit there and sit there and sit there and rust most of the piston because the rubber seal is at the inner end of it, and the outer portion of the piston is susceptible to getting moisture on it. So just drive your car once in a while.
Absolutely. And the last little bit of information, I know I'm jumping around, but when you do put your hard lines back on, or if you're putting new ones in, or you're putting the old ones back on, these should be started by hand, and they should pretty much go in almost all the way by hand. If you have to put a wrench on here to get this thing started or get it turned, you've cross-threaded. It's very tender, very, very tender. Again, I put that sealant on there, yeah. But, and then the other issue with brake lines is over time, these things have been taken off and put on so many times in 50 years, and they've been maybe over-tightened. So what will happen is the end of this ferrule will flare out. So you've loosened it out of the wheel cylinder. You know, you're sitting there and it's completely loose, and you're trying to pull it out and it won't come out. And you keep turning and turning and turning. It's like, how long is this thread? It should be done by now. Well, it's just stuck. It's stuck in there. So if that's the case, you really should get a new one. You should get a new line, or just at least put a new fitting on. I hope I've helped and kept your attention, and you feel it was worth coming. There's a lot of people here. See all 7 out there for sale.